Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into one of the most fascinating and frankly most inexplicably ignored rabbit holes in all of human history. I mean, stop and think for a second about how we document our past. We map out ancient battle formations in painstaking detail, right? We dedicate entire massive museums to ancient weaponry. And we know exactly what kings and emperors ate for breakfast. But there's this massive, glaring blind spot. Half of the human population has been dealing with a universal biological reality for literally as long as humans have existed, and yet it's treated like a historical ghost. Why on earth do historians meticulously detail every single brick used in ancient aqueducts, but completely ignore the daily, practical realities of women? It is a staggering question when you really sit down and think about it. Historians will spend countless pages on the logistics of some military campaign, and then write approximately 0 sentences on how a woman just dealt with her period while living her daily life. It's an enormous missing piece of our shared human story.
Listen, for tens of thousands of years, women have managed menstruation. This isn't some modern discovery. It is basic, everyday biology. Yet, the way history has recorded it, or, well, actually failed to record it, is shocking. For millennia, so many ancient cultures treated it like some kind of supernatural event instead of just a normal bodily function. And this wild mixture of fear, reverence, and absolute nonsense completely shaped how women were treated across civilizations for over 10,000 years.
Okay, let's dive into this because when you compare the historical records side by side, it is just mind-boggling. You can read absolute volumes on how the Romans mixed concrete or paved their roads, 40 pages on infrastructure. But when it comes to female biology, absolute silence. And the tools women used weren't just about hygiene, they were about survival, social survival, and honestly, literal survival. How a society answered the question of whether menstruation was sacred or dangerous pretty much determined absolutely everything about a woman's life.
Part 1. Egypt, Papyrus, and Pragmatism.
To find our pragmatic heroes in this historical narrative, we're heading straight to ancient Egypt. And as usual with the Egyptians, they were light years ahead. Just look at the date on this document, 1550 BCE. The Egyptians left us one of the oldest medical documents ever found, the Ebers Papyrus. And unlike later civilizations, they weren't ignoring female biology or looking away in embarrassment. No, they were actively documenting it. This papyrus contains specific, real references to gynecological conditions and treatments. They simply treated it as a medical reality that needed to be understood and managed.
So what were they actually using on a practical level? Well, the leading theory from historians and archaeologists is that Egyptian women engineered softened papyrus as a kind of primitive pad. And honestly, that tracks perfectly. Papyrus was literally everywhere, it was cheap, and it was relatively soft once they processed it. It was basically the ancient world's version of having everything you need right in your kitchen cabinet. They also likely used rolls of soft linen, which was highly absorbent, washable, and totally reusable. It was efficient, practical, and very on brand for the same civilization that invented calendars and monumental architecture.
But here is the absolutely crucial point, the cultural framework. In ancient Egypt, menstruation wasn't considered shameful, not at all. It was deeply, beautifully connected to fertility, to the powerful goddess Isis, and to the secret cycles of the Nile River itself. The flooding of the Nile was the literal lifeblood of their civilization, operating on a life-giving cycle that they saw as perfectly mirroring the female body. Because of this respect, women weren't locked away or treated as dangerous. They just continued living their full, active lives.
Part 2. Ancient Greece, the Great Contradiction.
Let's move to and see how this builds, but brace yourselves because we are violently shifting the narrative away from Egyptian sanity right now. When we compare these two ancient powers, a massive contrast emerges. On the left, you've got Egypt's biological pragmatism. On the right, Greece's philosophical absurdity. Where the Egyptians saw a natural cycle akin to their life-giving river, the brilliant, so-called logical men of Greece decided to overthink things to the point of utter nonsense, driven by an incredible, completely unearned confidence.
All right, let's talk about Aristotle for a second. Without a doubt, the guy is one of the most celebrated minds in Western history. A total genius in so many areas, right? But when he sat down to write about female biology, his conclusions were just, well, they were simply unhinged. He had this theory, a very loud, very confident theory, that ended up shaping medical history for centuries.
Yes, you are reading that quote correctly. Aristotle genuinely believed that menstrual blood was essentially failed semen. Actually, his exact theory was that women's bodies try to produce semen just like men did, but because women were inherently colder and weaker, the whole process just failed. And the result? Menstrual blood. Just let that sink in for a moment. And the craziest part? This wasn't some fringe conspiracy theory. This was the mainstream scientific consensus of the ancient Greek world.
So, because of this deeply flawed framework, the overarching Greek verdict was that women were fundamentally inferior. They were quite literally viewed biologically as broken men. This completely bizarre theory led an entire massive civilization to look at a perfectly natural biological function and use it as supposed scientific proof that women were weaker and lesser beings.
Part 3. Early Innovations. Wool and lint plugs. But you know what? Let's step away from the clueless philosophers scratching their heads in their scrolls, because what were the actual women of Greece doing? They were busy utilizing brilliant physical engineering. They were never passive victims of their biology. In a civilization built heavily around sheep farming, wool was absolutely everywhere. So they took this incredibly soft, highly absorbent material, fashioned it into small plugs, and secured everything with tightly worn fabric belts or loincloths around the hips. Sure, it wasn't glamorous, but it was incredibly functional.
And look at this definition here. If you thought the tampon was a modern invention, literally think again. The concept of inserting a soft material like wool or lint to absorb internal flow is an entirely ancient concept. We actually have early Greek medical texts that explicitly reference women using lint and wool in exactly this way to manage their flow. The modern disposable pad is barely 100 years old, but this ancient tech, it spans millennia.
And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate Greek contradiction. On one side, you have Aristotle confidently claiming women are just broken men. But on the exact same side of history, you have Hippocrates, the literal father of modern medicine, writing detailed texts stating that menstruation is a perfectly normal bodily function connected to overall health. In fact, according to him, missing periods were the actual medical problem. It's this stunning clash between male philosophy and actual medical science happening at the exact same time.
Part 4. The True Masters of Ancient Medicine.
So, as we look back across all these civilizations, it becomes incredibly clear who the true masters of ancient medicine really were. It was the generations of women who drove hygiene innovation straight from the shadows. The real obstacle for these women was never access to materials. Wool existed everywhere, cloth existed everywhere, sponges were super easy to find around the Mediterranean. No, the problem was the cultural taboo. When a society decided this biological function was sacred, women lived freely. But when a society decided it was shameful or impure, their movement and labor were heavily restricted. The materials were exactly the same. It was the societal framework that changed absolutely everything.
And here is why this matters so much to how we view history today. The true functional history of female biology lived purely in communities of women. It was generational knowledge, shared entirely orally. Women tested herbs for cramps, they figured out exactly which materials absorbed best, and they passed that practical science down from mother to daughter. The real tragedy here is that written history was penned by male outsiders who are entirely disconnected from that reality. Their records tell us a whole lot more about male fears and misunderstandings than they do about actual female life.
So I'm going to leave you with this thought. The daily experience of half the population barely even shows up in mainstream history, despite the fact that women developed sophisticated, highly functional solutions to a universal physical reality thousands of years ago. Cleopatra dealt with this. Roman women dealt with this. Aztec priestesses dealt with this. They figured it out, and they lived their lives. So isn't it about time our history books finally started doing the same? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking the questions that history forgot.